agreements, these memoranda, you agree to cooperate, you agree to develop a framework. What is that framework going to look like? How is that going to be implemented? And hence, I think all these summits, the time frame. So I think all these summits, including G20, G7, WTO, BRICS summit, whatever you have, you've got to look at them in a complete unstoppable continuum. It's not that the end of one summit really lets you arrive at something that you have achieved. What you've really achieved is just an agreement. And I think there's greater cooperation within the bloc. The bloc and the countries outside of the bloc will have to continue year after year after year, and these are not goals that are going to be, achieved in a short term, and they will have to keep evolving.
All right, but a consensus has been achieved at in a record time. The New Delhi Leaders' Declaration adopted, signed off. What remains is the implementation now. But let's quickly play that bite of Prime Minister Modi, where he talks about some consensus being reached. It was historic. Let's play that up. Minister's bite. All right, we may not have the Prime Minister's bite. I think we'll cut to it just very, very shortly from now. But, after that record declaration, Karthik, Krishna, there was a meeting where Sharpa, the foreign minister, the finance minister, and a host of people who were responsible for arriving at that consensus converged and talked about the key takeaways, which is what we are hoping to tell our viewers here. What came out of day one, essentially what came out of day one will encompass overall of what came out of the G20 summit. A lot of points were agreed on. Let's take them up one after the other. I think the most important point, at least from financial point of view, is an agreement on multilateral banks. What's the future going to be for multilateral banks, and a need for reforms?
So, Shweta, I think, again, we were talking about tangible, what comes out tangibly from any of these agreements or any of these, consensus that the G20 countries arrive at. I think in terms of consensus on the MDB reforms, there are some very, very clear guidelines set. And one of these is that the reforms within the MDBs themselves are no longer going to be the onus and responsibility of countries infusing their own government capital into keeping liquidity in these MDBs. And what is being agreed upon is that MDBs now should look at a hybrid sort of a model where private capital also comes in, where you look at an ecosystem, creating an ecosystem where private capital comes in, hybrid financing models come in, and you really make it work actually like a bank and not just as a charity organization.
Right.
So it's not that it's the onus of the US or the UK or the other rich, cash-rich countries to infuse capital into MDBs. And that capital being deployed in developing economies and emerging markets, but rather a more open marketplace sort of a model comes into play, where private capital infusion comes in. MDBs are strengthened to take capital from outside of the government ecosystem, get private players to participate, and really make it run like a non-profit but yet a business. So there has to be greater accountability, greater transparency, greater returns to shareholders. If you've taken private capital from a certain bank, you've got to pay that bank back in interest. And that deployment of capital, which you're doing in developed economies, in emerging markets, also needs to generate some sort of a return for MDBs.
Absolutely.
When it comes to those countries where this capital has been planted, to really make some virtue of the money that they have received. So a hybrid model where there is greater cooperation between government funding of MDBs as well as MDBs seeking private capital to add to liquidity and then deploying them in a more transparent manner, and where the terms of negotiation between how this debt is going to be repaid, where this debt to emerging markets and developing economies, is going to be used, and what are the broader contours of development has to be agreed upon between the MDBs and the countries that receive that grant.
All right, but let's quickly dip into what Finance Minister said while announcing the key takeaways of the New Delhi Declaration.
Of an independent panel on capital adequacy framework of the MDBs. So the CAF recommendations are focused on enabling MDBs to use their existing resources effectively. The roadmap estimates, this is going to be of interest for the media, the roadmap estimates that implementation of the CAF and the measures thereby will potentially yield additional lending headroom of approximately $200 billion over the next decade. So through these achievements, India has harnessed the opportunity provided by the G20 presidency to effectively articulate and embed the priorities of the global South in the larger global conversation on the MDB reforms. I move to the second, laying the building blocks for a globally coordinated and comprehensive policy and regulatory framework for crypto assets. The global push for clearer policies on crypto assets has gained momentum under the Indian presidency, and a global consensus is emerging on the same. The presidency will support the IMF and the FSB, and FSB is also setting the contours of the regulatory framework for a globally coordinated approach to crypto assets. So the presidency, with the support of IMF and the FSB, is setting these contours. The IMF and FSB synthesis paper, about which I've spoken to the media earlier, including a roadmap. On that, I just want to give my observation. This synthesis paper delves into how the policy and regulatory frameworks developed by the IMF and the FSB, alongside the other standard-setting bodies, will fit together and interact with each other.
All right, so that of course are the key takeaways from Finance Track, at least two of them, which is multilateral development banks and the need for development banks, the reforms, and how it's not charity. I think charity is an important word you used, Karthik. It's going to stay with me for a while after this bulletin. Essentially, charity is what it was looked at in a way when you had global financial institutions being hegemonized by certain Western blocs, and money would be dispersed as per whims and fancies of these Western blocs. You need banks and you need institutions which are outside of the, these Western bloc controlled financial institutions, and that is where multilateral development banks will help countries, especially African Union and a lot of South Asian countries which need money on an urgent basis.
You're right, Shweta. So exactly, I think, the whole consensus is that these MDBs, whether it is the World Bank or the IMF or the ADB or whatever you have, they've got to work as concrete businesses, but they're not in the business of making profits. They're in the business of returning value back to their creditors, back to institutions that they themselves lend from, to offer that debt to emerging economies.
And so as opposed to one country paying you,
it's not one. I mean, there's always been a block of countries. So, for example, 2 weeks before the G20 summit, US had pledged to invest or to sort of, offer another 25 billion to MDBs. Now, this US, grant to IMF and World Bank, the $25 billion is the money of the US Treasury, is the money of the US taxpayers. Now, the idea is that if you infuse a hybrid model here, you'll get private banks to also be in a position to lend to these MDBs, and thereby making these MDBs accountable to return the capital and the interest back to the capital, back to the lenders that they have received this grant from. So the objective is still not for the MDBs to actually make money, but run it like a business with the transparency, with the accountability of businesses, where you have taken money from, you have lent money and you have further lent it to another country in this case, and then when you get the return from that country, because this debt has to be repaid, it's not a grant, it's a debt. You are lending money to these emerging markets.
Different from China perhaps lending to different countries and also using it as a tool to control them geopolitically.
Yeah, so technically even the grant that China gives or the debt that China gives, let's say to a Sri Lanka, the objective there is that Sri Lanka will either pay back in cash with interest, or will lose control of a few of its assets. Those assets could include ports. Those assets could include some mining blocks.
And their decision-making, independent decision-making abilities as well.
With respect to the assets that they mortgage in this case, right? So it's a mortgage system.
Okay. So we also have shots coming in there from the third session of the G20 summit, which essentially is on One Future. We also have the tree planting ceremony visuals coming in from Bharat Mandapam South Plaza. Let's quickly play them up. Krishna, Karthik, that is the culmination. There's nothing on schedule after this, and I'm looking at it now. I mean, the third session will go on till 12:30 p.m., which will, of course, take place in the same venue. But everything has been reached at, consensus has been arrived.
Right, and there you go. India, in a sense, with that passing on the baton to Brazil. Lula da Silva, the recently elected Prime Minister of Brazil over there. And then you have Indonesia's Joko Widodo also receiving the plants. One thing I want to mention while seeing Prime Minister Modi is the life goals, a lifestyle for environment goals that Prime Minister Modi has been harping about, those finding mention at the G20 summit as well, and sort of setting the tone for the world on what kind of lifestyles that they should be having, where you conserve resources, you know, you reuse, recycle and reduce, you know, all those messages being sent out by India.
We have a bite from Prime Minister post that session. Let's quickly dip into it.
G20 के प्रेसिडेंट के तौर पर भारत पूरी दुनिया का आह्वान करता है कि हम मिलकर सबसे पहले इस ग्लोबल ट्रस्ट डेफिसिट को एक विश्वास, एक भरोसे में बदलें। यह हम सभी के साथ मिलकर चलने का समय है और इसलिए सबका साथ, सबका विकास, सबका विश्वास, सबका प्रयास का मंत्र हम सभी के लिए एक पथ प्रदर्शक बन सकता है। वैश्विक अर्थव्यवस्था में उथल-पुथल हो, नॉर्थ और साउथ का डिवाइड हो, ईस्ट और वेस्ट की दूरी हो, फूड, फ्यूल और फर्टिलाइजर का मैनेजमेंट हो, टेररिज्म और साइबर सिक्योरिटी हो, हेल्थ, एनर्जी और वाटर सिक्योरिटी हो, वर्तमान के साथ ही आने वाली पीढ़ियों के लिए हमें इन चुनौतियों के ठोस समाधान की तरफ बढ़ना ही होगा।
All right, that of course is the Prime Minister when he spoke yesterday at the inaugural session of the G20 summit. But dipping back to, you know, takeaways coming from the finance track, and one important, I think, key mention is that of cryptocurrency. It appears that G20 delegation has endorsed the IMF FSB paper that talks about need to regulate and not ban cryptocurrency, because that's not going to help it.
So again, Shweta, I think, you know, the synthesis paper, you know, crafted jointly by the IMF and the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, is again more of a roadmap, more of a framework, rather than a set of rules, rather than an agreement on what the eventual sort of, you know, future for cryptocurrencies should look like. I think the agreement has been arrived at, understanding has been arrived at that there is merit in all countries of the G20 bloc and now G20 plus African Union for that matter. So it's actually G21 or G20 plus 55 or however you want to look at. But basically the synthesis paper has been accepted as a good roadmap for countries to delve deeper into and hopefully arrive at by the year 2025, when this paper comes up for review again, where every country is going to actually, you know, be asked to put in further recommendations after reviewing how their countries have respectively implemented the framework, you know, prescribed by this FSB and IMF synthesis paper. Now again, what are the highlights here? I think the countries have broadly agreed that there is a very clear-cut need that by way of any sort of acceptance of cryptocurrency, any financial risk is protection of users who are eventually using cryptocurrencies to make any sort of transactions. The second is the entire stability of the monetary system per se. So all countries have agreed that, while the synthesis paper has also recommended it, but all countries seem to have agreed in the New Delhi Declaration that the cryptocurrency would, for no country, be legal tender replacing cash or replacing currency as we know it. So it's not going to be legal tender, it's not going to be legal currency. However, there is no ban on cryptocurrencies, neither is there an agreement on regulation of, there is agreement that cryptocurrency needs to be regulated. How it gets regulated, the synthesis paper doesn't sort of, elaborate much on that. There are ideas, there are suggestions, there is a framework for countries to look at objectively in their own respective context, and there would be a review 2 years from now in 2025, but until then there is still no decision on who moderates or who regulates cryptocurrencies. The only agreement thus far is that cryptocurrency for the G20 countries is not going to be legal tender, is not going to be legal currency.
The G20 has now said and firmly agreed on it's not legal, but it will be regulated.
Not legal tender.
Not legal tender, which essentially means it's not legal.
Which means
Karthik,
it's not,
because
no,
if cryptocurrency is used for exchange of money.
Legal tender is cash currency.
Exactly.
Legal tender
so, but that is the
money,
use
right?
of cryptocurrency,
Now,
isn't it?
You could use it as a barter tool.
But that
a barter
okay.
is not legal tender.
Okay.
Right. It doesn't buy you goods and services of the prescribed value. A 100 rupee note will buy you goods and services worth 100 rupees.
Right.
Cryptocurrencies by their nature are volatile. They are driven by laws of demand and supply. Their value appreciates or depreciates. So cryptocurrencies cannot replace cash.
Okay.
And that is legal tender, right? Cash is legal tender.
Right. I want to understand from you.
Yeah.
So, for example, you hire me for a service and you pay me in cryptocurrency. Would that then be legal, since it's not a legal tender?
No.
But you're paying me for my service.
No.
So essentially saying it's a ban.
So cryptocurrency is not part of the monetary policy of any country.
Right. So would it then not be right to say it's banned?
It's not banned. It's not banned. Different countries have different taxes on
Right.
it. It is not illegal even in India to use cryptocurrencies.
Okay.
It's just that if you trade in cryptocurrencies and you make profits, you pay a 30% tax to the government. But if you make losses, you can't mitigate those losses against the profits you've made. So for every profit that you make on cryptocurrencies, you pay the government 30% tax, no matter what income bracket you are in. So by way of cryptocurrency being taxed in India, it does not make cryptocurrencies illegal, because there is a formal taxation framework.
Okay.
But
so
cryptocurrency
there is
cannot
a
replace cash. You can't go to the market and you cannot go to a store and use cryptocurrency to purchase a good or a service.
Right.
But you can trade in cryptocurrencies. For example, you cannot go to the market and use your mutual funds or your SIP or your fixed deposit even to make a transaction.
Got
it's
it.
It's a financial asset.
Okay.
It is not a monetary asset.
Got
right. So it's a financial asset. However, that financial asset up until now across the world is unregulated. So in the case of mutual funds, while you can't make a transaction, if you happen to lose money, or if a company dealing with mutual funds goes kaput, you have SEBI who steps in and protects your interests. So
in crypto's case, no one
in
will.
crypto, you don't have a regulator. It is neither the RBI nor SEBI, nor the Ministry of Finance.
And this is what the regulation will
Now,
do?
the regulation is saying that every country needs to arrive at a framework. The synthesis paper recommends, and that synthesis paper, which has been accepted or adopted in the New Delhi Declaration, states that every country will have to work towards regulating cryptocurrencies with the objective of mitigating risks therein, risks for individuals as well as risks for the monetary stability of every country.
Okay.
So those are the systemic and individual risks which will have to be monitored, and a regulation for each country will have to be arrived upon. And that is the consensus. That is the agreement that, yeah, all G20 countries are going to individually work within their own geographic confines and political confines to arrive at some way of regulating cryptocurrencies. However, cryptocurrency is not banned. Cryptocurrency is not illegal, but cryptocurrency is not legal tender. It will not replace the existing cash system.
And some sort of regulation and template will be arrived at a later summit of finance minister and central bank governors in Morocco. Now, Morocco obviously is dealing with its own natural disaster at the moment. More than 600 people have died as a result of the earthquake. So we don't know whether it's going to happen by the end of October, but that is what the finance minister said while addressing media at that press conference. Let's also quickly dip into a bite that has come in, by the way. I think one of the major highlights of G20 is, by the way, of an India, Middle East, EU corridor. Let's quickly listen in to Prime Minister on what it means for the future of these three blocks.
आज हम सब ने एक महत्वपूर्ण और ऐतिहासिक समझौता संपन्न होते हुए देखा है। आने वाले समय में यह भारत, पश्चिम एशिया और यूरोप के बीच इकोनॉमिक इंटीग्रेशन का प्रभावी माध्यम होगा। यह पूरे विश्व में कनेक्टिविटी और विकास को सस्टेनेबल दिशा प्रदान करेगा। मैं हिज एक्सेलेंसी राष्ट्रपति बाइडेन, हिज रॉयल हाइनेस क्राउन प्रिंस एंड प्राइम मिनिस्टर मोहम्मद बिन सलमान, हिज रॉयल हाइनेस राष्ट्रपति शेख मोहम्मद बिन जायद, हिज एक्सेलेंसी राष्ट्रपति मैक्रो, हिज एक्सेलेंसी चांसलर सोल्च, हर एक्सेलेंसी प्रधानमंत्री मेलोनी और हर एक्सेलेंसी प्रेसिडेंट वॉन डेर लेयन, इन सबको इस इनिशिएटिव के लिए मैं बहुत बहुत बधाई देता हूं। भारत कनेक्टिविटी को क्षेत्रीय सीमाओं में नहीं मापता। सभी क्षेत्रों के साथ कनेक्टिविटी बढ़ाना भारत की मुख्य प्राथमिकता है। हमारा मानना है कि कनेक्टिविटी विभिन्न देशों के बीच आपसी व्यापार ही नहीं, आपसी विश्वास भी बढ़ाने का स्रोत है। कनेक्टिविटी इनिशिएटिव्स को प्रमोट करते हुए कुछ मूलभूत सिद्धांतों का सुनिश्चित किया जाना महत्वपूर्ण है, जैसे अंतर्राष्ट्रीय नॉर्म्स, रूल्स तथा लॉज का पालन, सभी देशों की संप्रभुता और क्षेत्रीय अखंडता का सम्मान, डेट बर्डन की जगह फाइनेंशियल वायबिलिटी को बढ़ावा देना और पर्यावरण के सभी मापदंडों का पालन करना। आज जब हम कनेक्टिविटी का इतना बड़ा इनिशिएटिव ले रहे हैं, तब हम आने वाली पीढ़ियों के सपनों के विस्तार के बीज बो रहे हैं। मैं इस ऐतिहासिक अवसर पर सभी लीडर्स को मैं बहुत बहुत शुभकामनाएं देता हूं और सबका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद करता हूं। मजबूत कनेक्टिविटी और इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर मानव सभ्यता के विकास का मूल आधार है। भारत ने अपनी विकास यात्रा में इस विषय को सर्वोच्च प्राथमिकता दी है। फिजिकल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर के साथ साथ सोशल, डिजिटल तथा फाइनेंशियल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर में अभूतपूर्व पैमाने पर निवेश हो रहा है। इससे हम एक विकसित भारत की मजबूत नींव रख रहे हैं। हमने ग्लोबल साउथ के अनेक देशों में एक विश्वसनीय पार्टनर के रूप में एनर्जी, रेलवे, वाटर, टेक्नोलॉजी पार्क्स जैसे क्षेत्रों में इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर प्रोजेक्ट्स इंप्लीमेंट किए हैं। इन प्रयासों में हमने डिमांड ड्रिवन और ट्रांसपेरेंट अप्रोच पर विशेष रूप से बल दिया है। पीजीआईआई के माध्यम से हम ग्लोबल साउथ के देशों में इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर गैप को कम करने में महत्वपूर्ण योगदान दे सकते हैं।
All right, a major stride made as far as global connectivity is concerned through better infrastructure. For all those looking at this bulletin at this point, I want to understand, Karthik, Krishna, why is this significant? What is the importance of an India, Middle East, Europe corridor?
Well, Shweta, I think first and foremost, trade.
Okay.
Efficiency in trade. Okay, let's break it down.
Right.
What is this
Absolutely.
corridor? What is this corridor? Number one, it's an economic corridor.
Okay.
Okay. What is an economic corridor? We have economic corridors running through the length and breadth of India, right? Delhi and Mumbai is connected through an economic corridor. What does that mean? There is a great highway, there are great railway links, and there is great infrastructure connectivity between, let's say, Delhi and Mumbai, right? Now, what does this do? This helps free flow of trade. This helps free flow of people. This helps free flow of talent and free flow of the entire supply chain that drives the economy, right? So when you talk about a Delhi-Mumbai economic corridor, you're talking about your domestic interest. Now juxtapose this, that you're not actually just connecting Delhi and Mumbai, that's already connected, but what if Mumbai gets connected to the US?
Okay.
Bypassing China, bypassing Pakistan, which are of economic disinterest to us right now, you take the route from the west coast of India, from Mumbai, cut across all the way to UAE, Israel, and reach Europe, right? So that is the economic corridor being developed or being agreed upon between 4 countries, and this is the I2U2 block, right? Yet another block. So just for ample clarity, this is not part of the New Delhi Declaration. This announcement that we heard from the Prime Minister is not part of G20 per se. This is on the sidelines of G20, but what an opportunity to actually have that multilateral agreement also arrived at, agreed upon, right? So what is I2U2? I2U2 is, I mean, Modi is great at acronyms. So India, Israel, UAE,
and US.
USA.
Okay.
Right, I2U2, simple. Now, why are we so bullish on creating this economic corridor? Obviously, we want to really strengthen our trade relationships with the Middle East, have a clear access straight into Europe.
Okay.
Right? You don't need China, you don't need Pakistan, you don't need to go through that narrow Suez Canal. You need new infrastructure, fresh infrastructure created and managed by this block of I2U2, which gives India access to Europe, Europe access to India, India access to Middle East, Middle East access to India, Middle East access to Europe, Europe access to Middle East, and through Europe, US gets connected, right? So it's a massive corridor. I don't know how many thousands of kilometers is going to be, right? But primarily, we are trying to, through this I2U2, through this economic corridor, trying to again create an alternative to what China has heavily invested in over the last many years, called the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, for which China has already invested more than $1 trillion US, right? So it is a clear-cut economic decision being made in the larger interest of the world to create an alternative supply chain to China's existing supply chains and existing trade routes, silk routes, so to speak, with the world, right? So China has already invested enough and more and will continue to make those investments to create such economic corridors through its Belt and Road Initiative, which connects its borders and inroads into other countries, neighboring countries, and therein to the rest of the world, right? India is taking the sea route and connecting Mumbai directly with UAE, right? And beyond that, the map that I just verbally sort of, try to explain. Now, what all does this entail? It entails a road network. It entails a railway network. So it's you're looking at movement of freight also through wheels of the wagon. You're looking at trains to be able to carry, let's say, containers after containers of oil from Middle East back to India. Right, you don't need to be dependent only on shipping lines, but shipping lines and ports are also part of this economic corridor. So there's road, there's railway, there's ports, then there is data connectivity. So when we are talking about a digital economy, we are talking about a global connected economy. Data is also something that becomes a very, very potent tool here. So when you talk about 6G technologies making an entry into India, into the world, actually, I don't think anybody in the world uses 6G right now, but this 6G is also going to need optical fiber, is also going to need, rolls and seams of optical fiber networks, under the surface of the earth, under the sea beds, connecting data pipelines from one part of the world to another.
Right.
So there is railway, there is road, there is ports. No points for guessing in Israel, which is going to be the largest conduit port to facilitate trade.
The Haifa port.
Haifa port. And who has inked a partnership with Haifa board?
The Adani Group.
Absolutely. Right. So I think I will definitely want to watch out for Adani stocks tomorrow morning.
but keen eye on all infra stocks for tomorrow
all infra
morning.
Stocks and not
Specifically Adani stocks.
Yeah,
what he was
yeah,
saying.
yeah. So I think, yeah, broadly it's an economic corridor. It is going to be barrier-free, barrier-less connectivity and trade between these four blocks, so to speak, where India, the leader of the global south, but India per se itself, the Middle East, Israel, Europe, and then USA, all gets connected, and these are trade lines that get set up.
All right. You know, Krishna, some would say this is a snub to China, and perhaps Chinese premier knew it. I mean, of the variety of reasons people are counting for Chinese premier not making it to India. We know why Russian president did not make it, but we don't know why China said no. This could be one of the reasons, because there's already a lot of chatter and talks about a lot of bilateral conversations, which, by the way, India did not have with the visiting, Chinese Premier Li Qiang. And, there were other bilateral conversations that India had with the UK, Japan, US, and so on and so forth. So perhaps Chinese knew that there's going to be a big snub coming by the way of an alternate world-class trade route, among others.
I mean, when you look at it in hindsight, that's the easiest conclusion I can make. If the Chinese knew that a challenger, an open challenger which involves the US, comes up against their One Belt, One Road initiative, then that will be a huge, ego hurt, so to speak, for China. Either which way, we're talking about the fact that Chinese Premier Xi Jinping not making it over here, simply because, this is India's moment where it sort of reasserts itself as a global power as the president of the G20. And there in itself, there was a problem for China, is what we thought when the first rejection came. China is not happy watching India lead the world in a global summit like the G20, as big as the G20. But then again, now you have to recalibrate those things because of what has just happened right now. An incredible infrastructure corridor that spans 3-4 continents, so to speak. It's incredible as to what has been achieved over here. Yes, the timing for how long will this take to be done and everything, is still there. We have to work it out. But the same with One Belt, One Road initiative. It takes a lot of time. These are, globe-changing developments. And here you have India literally looking at China in the eye going, you do that, we do this, we have partners, we have very wealthy partners to do this. Sure, that's not going down all that well with China, Shweta.
All right, and fresh competition, by the way, of a new economic corridor. And I think we were discussing this right in the middle of a break, whether this is going to happen anytime soon. Karthik says not in his lifetime.
I mean, see, it's a function of all these four blocks or four countries, so to speak, arriving at who invests how much.
Right.
Right. I think that negotiation, number one, you've got to look at it as a project, and that project does not have one project manager, will have 4 project managers, right?
Actually, so many project managers.
Many, but at least,
right.
The Minister of Infrastructure for each country is definitely one key player in this top leadership of 4, right? Now, there are definitely 4 project managers to this, right? There is going to be some sort of a consensus to be arrived between them. There is going to be, if you look at it as a project, there is going to be a P&L to be made. There is investment to be made, right? Who bears how much of that investment? Who contracts what part of development to which vendor? Identification of a vendor which has the scale, the capacity, the capability. And again, I have a few guesses on who might get, India's part of the contract. And of course, we have large airport and port developers in India, and the Adani Group, of course, has bagged enough and more contracts of ports and airports.
Yeah.
So it is one of the most obvious fits. But then again, there is going to be subcontracting. You see an L&T coming in, right? You see, you
have options in this country.
You have enough and more options, right? So number one, the 4 countries deciding on the route, the exact route, the length of the route,
mapping that route,
right? And then procuring the material, procuring the arriving at the cost, and then arriving at who bears how much cost, and then actually the foundation stones in each of the 4 countries being built, and then you flank off in either direction. For India, there is one direction, we are just taking the west route, but look at Israel, for example. It'll have to have some infrastructure going east, some infrastructure going west, right? And now this massive Arabian Sea, between UAE and Mumbai and India, which part of that comes in which sea treaty, controlled by whom, and who has more influence there, and then who is going to bear the burden of the cost, right. And then of course the whole science, the technology of building routes like those is a mammoth project. I mean,
absolutely.
if it happens,
rejig my geography while you were saying that. Okay,
I think if it happens in this decade, if there is at least a 5%, 8%, 10% completion even within this decade, it is some achievement. But this again is, I would sort of stick my neck out and say it's at least a 20-year
You're going to live, Karthik.
Yeah, sure.
You'll
I mean,
see.
sure. I might not be as relevant.
Just to add to Karthik, what you're saying, as you were talking, Karthik, just reminded me the fact that how different it is from the One Belt, One Road initiative of China, which is mainly driven by China, with everybody else being a minor partner to that One Belt, One Road initiative. This way, India is teaching a lesson to the world of how to do these things. In this way, four countries are equal partners in a global infrastructure project. This is like India wanting to do the right things the right way and really setting the tone for it when it's a G20 president. I'm not surprised that China is not over here. China's Xi Jinping is not over here, because
we heard the Prime Minister say "Sabka Saath and Sabka Vishwas."
But again, I think just to sort of differ a little bit. I know it would have been a diplomatic challenge with China around at the G20 summit, but again, China would have had little to no say in an economic corridor which is not part of G20.
Exactly.
It's on the sidelines of G20.
But Karthik, I was only referring to the fact that China first, when Xi Jinping refused to come to the G20 summit, I thought it was a matter of China not being able to digest the fact that India is going to be an equal in a matter of time. India is an equal in so many other ways already. It's going to be a matter of time. India is well on its way to being the next China, if I may, or a new China, which is India in that sense. So I think China, which has been ruling the roost for the last 3 decades, is finding it hard to digest that India has now come up trumps, and India is looking at it in the eye and giving it back in its own currency, if I may. So I think therein lies that ego issue, Shweta. It is China's inability to digest India's progress.
All right, those are big words. I don't know how much of that is true, but diplomatically speaking, I think that's the message that is coming out of Xi Jinping's absence from such a significant global summit.
While I agree with what Krishna is referring to here, and there is definitely a thought there, which I would also need some time to digest, that is it actually competition with India and some sort of a neighbors envy sort of a scenario playing
like
out, or is it a scenario where China is saying, hey, the West doesn't like me, I don't like the West. India doesn't like me, I don't like India. I have other interests in India, especially at the borders. But, I want to rather use my influence in another bloc called the BRICS. So you saw Xi Jinping
making it to the
a
BRICS.
great role at the BRICS summit that happened just last month, in the month of August, and then deciding that, let me give G20 a skip, because nothing concrete for China is going to come out of it anyway. I will not be able to exercise much influence with West,
G20.
with India, and India may be wanting to snub me, not shake hands with me. I don't want to, run through that embarrassment. And at the same time, let me rather use my influence in an area where I can dominate.
And
that
let's
happens
not
to be the
forget a
BRICS.
meeting between Prime Minister and Xi Jinping already happened at BRICS. So there were some conversations that happened on the sideline of the BRICS event. So that has already happened. Perhaps if anybody Xi Jinping was avoiding, it was Joe Biden and not Prime Minister Modi.
Definitely.
That is,
and I completely agree with that. And here you go. The global problem is US versus China, right? And here you have India, where you don't have to ask a question as to which side of the debate that India is on. We're on the side of the US. So China is going to be like, hey, I'm done. You friends hang out together. That's what's happening. China is
I'd like to believe, come to think of it, we are on no side at all. I think that is what a consensus proves.
We are on our own side.
We are on our own
which
side.
Which every country is.
Absolutely.
Right? I think at the end of the day, China is on the side of China, US is on the side of US,
and India is
on the side of India. So at the end of the day, wherever you get a better deal, wherever you get more influence, wherever you get, something that is going to help you make faster progress, and there is a win-win at play, you walk on that road. Wherever there's a win-lose.
My question is that all of that you're talking
India,
about, a win-win, better deal, all of it is happening India-US.
India-US.
It's not happening India-China.
Absolutely. So definitely not happening US-China.
Definitely not happening US-China.
And since we don't have a lot of time, I quickly also want to touch upon another interesting area, especially for India. What India was pushing for is digital public infrastructure. A DPI and a consensus on what's going to be the definition and why do we need digital public infrastructure, a common infrastructure in all G20 countries, that has also been arrived at.
Absolutely. So again, I think financial inclusion being a great agenda, great item to be ticked off the finance track. Financial inclusion is not much of a worry for the developed bloc already, right? They are financially inclusive, they have social security, they have bank accounts, they have practically everything they need to have their financial system running. I think the entire DPI stack and financial inclusion by way of DPI, which is the digital public infrastructure, the architecture that we refer to as India stack, is absolutely relevant for developing economies. So when it comes to now the African Union being made part of the G20, you have a very, very clear-cut case here that financial inclusion using technology, using a technology stack as robust as the DPI that India has developed, becomes a global benchmark. And India has actually taken this onus of creating a global framework around DPI. So it is not just the export of the existing India DPI, but it is actually going to be a global framework that India has volunteered to develop for the emerging economies, including those in Africa, where financial inclusion using technology and using the architecture that India has built becomes easy to replicate in different countries. There are certain challenges there as well. Some of those challenges, of course, include transmission of data, free flow of data, data protection, data privacy. And while India is taking the leadership role there, I think it is going to be equally imperative for India, under this global framework that it has volunteered to develop, to also take one step further and ensure that data protection and no misuse of data, even in those geographies where some version of the existing DPI will get implemented, those concerns need to be taken care of.
All right. So DPI, essentially, if we break it down for consumption of general public, DPI include what, Karthik? It includes your UPI. It includes every public digital infrastructure that, is freely made available to people living in a country, within the confines of the country, and allows them to operate digitally.
So, okay. So if we were to really break it down, DPI, so UPI is an application that runs on DPI.
Correct.
Right. What is this architecture? What is the foundation over which you have your
ONDC.
KYC happening?
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Not ONDC as much, I believe, to the best of my knowledge, but you open a bank account, right? Now, whenever you get somebody over to your house or you visit a branch and you do your biometrics or somebody takes your photograph, right? Your KYC is done within seconds.
Right.
How? Because there is this infrastructure available on which your biometric information, which is linked to your Aadhaar, rests. So there is a direct interface between the retail branch across every bank in India, across every brand of bank in India, connected to this infrastructure on which your KYC can happen in a matter of seconds.
Right.
Right.
So Aadhaar makes use of the digital public infrastructure.
Yes. So Aadhaar is one of the pillars of DPI, right? Which is your a universal digital identity, right? And a unique digital identity, right? Next is, let's say, your mobile numbers. Why did we have such a hullabaloo around connecting Aadhaar to mobile numbers, right? So one Aadhaar, one mobile number. It becomes a critical case of matching that, okay, I have verified that this is the person who has opened a bank account, has done KYC. Now, how do I get in touch with this person? If I were to send, an OTP to this number to verify his identity, there needs to be a linkage of a mobile number.
Right.
So mobile becomes a second layer here. And then, of course, all the bank accounts, the Jan Dhan, all the government schemes around direct beneficiary transfers, the Ayushman Bharat scheme, any welfare program that the government runs, for it to make sure that it finds its way to the right beneficiary, whether through financial inclusion, whether through DBT, whether through opening of bank accounts, or whether to even identify whether a person is alive or dead, rests on this large architecture called the DPI, the Digital Public Infrastructure, which we refer to as the India Stack.
Okay.
So
since I was mentioning
becomes,
ONDC,
UPI,
isn't ONDC also, ONDC and the way it works, its operation is also derived from the digital public infrastructure that is available to
I mean,
people.
there could be some linkages, Shweta. I'm sorry, I don't really, I don't know if there's a,
Okay.
I mean, I'm unable to right now assimilate
That-
a direct,
right.
logical possibility of this connection. I'm sure there might be some connection that you're referring to, but UPI becomes critical here again.
Right.
So the transactions that Indians do using UPI, these are bank-to-bank transactions. These bank-to-bank transactions are happening real time, again using the layers and layers of data which rests on this India stack, on this DPI. So I scan a code and I send you money. Your bank account and my bank account get integrated to one another using that scan and pay technology. And that channel, that flow of money, not physical money, but information that money needs to be debited and money needs to be credited, happens through these layers of data which constitute this architecture called DPI.
All right, and that is good news for India. India's been pushing for it for a while
I
now.
think not as much for India. I don't think the end objective here is for India to make money by
Not
way
at
of
all,
exporting
but
this. But
show its prowess
so
as far
future,
as
we are
what...
talking about one future, we are talking about, one world, one future. I think it is pretty much setting a case and leading by example that, we are taking one step forward in creating one future when it comes to financial inclusion across the world.
All
And
right.
one UPI for the world, hopefully.
Okay, well, that's a big ask, but let's see whether that happens or not. But before we wrap up, let me quickly take you through the key takeaways from the G20 summit day one. Remember, the 55-nation African Union joined G20 group. It will now hopefully be known as G21 from next time onward. I'll request my team to play up, the key takeaways for our viewers to see what's going to happen next. Remember, Prime Minister Modi also announced unanimous adoption of the G20 New Delhi Leaders Declaration. That consensus was arrived at a very quick pace within hours of the G20 summit beginning here in the national capital. An India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor was also announced, linking India, Saudi Arabia, Gulf, Arab states and EU. There was a big, on the sidelines of the main summit, there was a big congregation of leaders from all of these countries talking about need for linking infrastructure, and that perhaps could happen in some or maybe a couple of decades from now. But also was announced a global Biofuel Alliance launched to boost the use of cleaner fuels and what it could mean perhaps for the future of sustainable living, sustainable use, and as an alternative to oil and crude oil perhaps. Remember, 19 countries signed up for that. The countries that did not sign up include, Russia, one of the oil producing countries of the G20 summit, or G20 members rather. Also, G20 members agreed on better, bigger and more effective multilateral development banks, need for reforms in the multilateral development banks. A consensus was also arrived at for crypto assets. Now, G20 nations agreed for a regulation that could perhaps be arrived at later in the month of October. The G20 also adopted framework for digital public infrastructure, recognizing the role of DPI in delivery of services. Those, of course, are the big key takeaways from the day one of the G20 summit. Day two is still ongoing. It will close at about 12:30. We keep bringing you all the updates, but at this point, that's all we have on this bulletin. Thank you very much for watching.
ChatGPT. It can generate codes and human-like responses through text, write stories, and do a lot more.
I work in a newsroom with anchors, researchers and scriptwriters, graphic artists, producers, video editors, camera crew. But does a newsroom really need them today?
All of us have to think about unique and distinctive value addition that cannot be automated or repeated or replaced by a machine.
ChatGPT may kill many companies.
A human has to be in the loop with an ability to control this.
Dark Side of the Boom. Streaming now.
The historical moment, and it's here. Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, loses to 16-year-old Pragnananda.
The beauty of sports is the emergence of new heroes and the triumph of the underdog. Chennai teenager R. Pragnananda too finds himself in that bracket. Having made